Hello to all of those who are tuning into this session today. This session is designed to support parents of young autistic kids, or perhaps suspecting their child may be autistic, or if you just want to learn more about this topic, perhaps you know someone with an autistic child. So if that's you, then you are in the right place. So thank you for sharing your time with me today. I'm Erin. I'm so honored to be invited to share on this topic and to help you shift or deepen your understanding about supporting the communication of autistic children in an affirming way. I truly believe at the core of what we all want is to nurture all kids to grow and flourish. And my hope is that the information shared today will start to fundamentally shift the way you support, engage with, and understand neurodivergent children. So I'd love to start by telling you who I am, why you should even listen to me, right? So I'm a speech language practitioner and I run my own private practice called Wild Seeds SLP, based in the lovely Victoria, BC. I've been in SLP for over 12 years, and the majority of my career was actually spent working in multiple school districts before I moved primarily into supporting autistic children in their homes and in the community. I strongly believe in using neurodiversity affirming practices, and I'm honored that I now get to support others in learning more about this shift to these practices. What nurtures my wild seed is to find a little bit of play in the everyday. And one fun fact about me is that I'm also a children's book co-author, which was a very fun project to be a part of. So now I'd like to share something a little more personal with you. So I'm not a parent myself, but I truly believe we share a thread of something deeply important to us. And that's that deep desire for every child to feel like they truly belong in every space, their home, family spaces, school, and even broader community spaces. And that they're not just included, but genuinely accepted, respected, and understood for who they are. And that's really been a guiding value in my work for a long time. And I imagine it's one you may hold close to. But I gotta be real with you for a second. I do have a bit of a confession. The way I was showing up and supporting autistic kids earlier in my career didn't align with my values. I had a lot of misunderstanding of the kids I was supporting. I had a lot of assumptions of what I thought autism was. And I was using techniques I thought I was supposed to do, even though my intuition was screaming, nope, not this way. And when I was reflecting on this, my mind kept coming back to a specific child I was supporting a few years ago now. And at the time, he was new to me, and I was seeing him in his home. And I didn't know much about him ahead of time, except I knew he was a young autistic boy who didn't typically communicate with spoken language, and he had high support needs. The first time I walked through the door to his house, I showed up with just like so much excitement to meet him and play together. I was like, this is gonna go so well. But instead, I was met with this quick flash of red hair running past me, followed shortly by a loud shrieking sound that came from behind the couch. The challenge became apparent almost immediately. This child wanted nothing to do with me in his home. Anytime I tried to go near him, he would run away, he would hide, he would desperately cry out. It was clear that this child did not feel safe with me. Now, his mom, with all her best intentions and using the tools she had been encouraged to use, told me that the only way they've been able to get him to like interact and do work with other people was to use a token board to complete tasks so that he could earn time to watch videos on his phone. Now, my gut and my intuition were telling me that this didn't feel right, but I agreed to give it a try anyway. And as I watched him reluctantly complete some random sorting activities, sitting at this small round table in their living room. I also witnessed this very distressed expression that completely took over his face. My heart absolutely sank. There was no connection, no motivation, no joy, and really no real learning. It felt performative and transactional rather than anything meaningful. And I did not feel like I was supporting this child's well-being, but I was checking off completed tasks. And I remember getting into my car after that session feeling absolutely miserable. I felt lost about how to support him and worried that I wouldn't be able to actually help him. And the hardest part was that I knew that method didn't align with my values. And honestly, kind of just left me with a feeling of the like pit in my stomach. And that same night, as I was scrolling the internet, as one might do when they're trying to regulate after a hard day, I came across a post that said, "Is your work in line with your values and autism best practices? Take our quiz." And I remember thinking, wow, this feels very aligned, an aligned coincidence that I'm seeing this right now. But anyway, I jumped into doing that quiz so fast. And this is where I learned about this is the first time I learned about this term neurodiversity affirming practices, and where I had to confront an uncomfortable truth that even though I saw myself as being a helper, some of the practices I was using weren't actually to the long-term benefit of this autistic child. So this is when I realized that I needed to make a decision to either have to keep pushing through methods that I felt didn't align with me or venture down a new path. So I did more deep diving into the topic of affirming practices, and the more I read, the more I was like, yes, this is what feels so aligned with my natural way of being and thinking. It just felt so validating to read about the importance of focusing on creating connection first. And I knew this was the way forward, and really there was no turning back for me after that. So what happened after was my time with this sweet and observant red-haired boy drastically shifted when I moved my focus onto building safety and trust, inviting him into sensory play, and engaging in his unique interests. And soon I was the one to be rewarded with witnessing the best full-bellied laughs, huge smiles, authentic play interactions, plus the added bonus of seeing him expand his communication in every session. So no force, no token board required, and instead an authentic desire to interact and learn with me. And the reason I share this is because I came to realize from this experience was that when a child feels accepted and understood, they are more open to learning and growing alongside you. This experience and realization really inspired me to want to be a change maker and share this information about neurodiversity affirming practices with more people so that they can truly honor and support a child's well-being and see the shifts like I do. So today we are talking about supporting communication for autistic children and a shift to neurodiversity affirming practices. Yet this in itself is an incredibly large topic, and we are only going to be able to scratch the surface in our short time in this session. So I won't be able to cover all aspects of communication supports, especially the nuances and the complexities. Yet I tried to design this session so that the majority of the information I'm going to be talking about is going to be applicable to any situation. I also want to mention that although we are talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergent people, I will mainly relate the information specifically to autistic children, as those are who I have the most experience learning from and interacting with. I do also want to state that I am only one perspective and I do not identify as autistic myself, although I am exploring my own neurodivergence and what that looks like for me. Um, but I would highly encourage you to continue learning by listening to the lived experiences of autistic and other neurodivergent folks. So, my goals for today are to help you understand how we are shifting support for autistic kids towards affirming care, uncover the secret sauce to communication growth, learn about a unique autistic communication style that you may not have heard of, help you understand the foundations of communication that you may be missing, and give you some strategies that you can add to your toolbox for supporting communication development. Okay, so I have something to show you. I'm going to try to show it on my screen here. I have placed a tiny seed inside a tiny jar, and I'd like you to pretend for a moment that you're holding your very own seed. Perhaps you're just cradling it in your hands, so you can have a shared imagination with me for a moment. And really, this seed is a metaphor. This seed is a representation of the autistic child in your life. A little wild seed, if you will. A seed with potential to grow and flourish. But we know that this seed will not begin to sprout inside of this tiny jar because it's not the right environment for the seed. The seed is designed to keep itself protected until it finds the right set of conditions that it specifically needs. In a similar sense, when we are looking at how to effectively support an autistic child, we aren't focused on what's wrong with them and how to fix them. We can instead shift our focus to a place of curiosity, of what's in the child's environment that we can add in or take out. What can we change or nourish? It reminded me of this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you do not blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. You never blame the lettuce. Your child is their own wild seed, and our job as the supportive adults is to open up the jar and tend to their environment. Because each little wild seed will grow at a different pace, requiring different nutrients and conditions to flourish, yet ready to bloom in their own time. And this concept is an important foundation to understanding the shift to neurodiversity affirming care. We have a greater understanding now that autistic people think, learn, interact, and experience the world in different ways. You may have heard a lot of language, as a parent that focuses on what your child can't do, especially if you've gone through a diagnostic process. Maybe what's delayed or what's considered a deficit. And that kind of language can feel heavy. It can leave you wondering if something is wrong with your child. But please hear this. Your child is not broken. There is nothing to fix about them. Instead, we are understanding that autistic brains work differently, and those differences don't mean a deficit. We are shifting our focus from viewing an autistic child as a problem to be solved or seeing all of their actions as something that needs to be fixed, and instead looking at it from the perspective of an individual to be understood. We are flipping the script about autism. And this mindset shift is really at the core of neurodiversity affirming care. We are moving away from focusing on how well an autistic child can perform certain tasks, meet developmental checklists just to appear on track or to blend in with the other kids around them. Instead, we are asking deeper questions like, does this child feel safe, understood, connected? Neurodiversity affirming care isn't about pushing children to meet typical milestones on someone else's timeline. It's about supporting them in building a life that works for them in the ways that feel most natural and meaningful. We are creating a culture of acceptance around autistic differences. And together, we are ushering in a powerful new era of affirming care. Now, as we move deeper into our topic of communication supports, there is a common misconception that I'd first like to address. So, I think people often associate the word communication or the idea of communication specifically to mean the spoken words that we use. And we might have our focus specifically on that and supporting them to use spoken words. But communication is so much deeper and more complex than just the words we hear a child using. So I'd like us to shatter this idea that communication equals spoken words. Instead, I like to think of it more like a dance of information. A dance of information that we continuously provide back and forth to each other. So, really, communication is about messages. And it can take many forms, including actions, gestures, body movements or positions, facial expression, your tone of voice, writing, drawing, and using other picture symbolism. It's multimodal. Now, a hard truth I need us to consider is that how a child communicates is really not up to us. We can't force it. It's actually totally out of our control. But what is in our control is creating the most communication rich environment possible. So we can shape the environment, like in our homes or at school, to give the most optimal opportunity to expand their communication skills. Thinking back to our wild seed metaphor, the focus of our role as the supportive adult isn't to cause the seed to grow into a flower, but instead to be the gardener that nourishes the soil. Okay, so how do we build a communication-rich environment that aligns with affirming care? Well, communication support can take many forms, but today we're going to focus on these four branches. So I'm calling these our communication support branches. First is messages we give to ourselves. Second is messages we give to others directly about a child. Third is messages we give directly to a child. And then fourth is interpreting the messages we receive from a child. So ourselves, about, to a child, and then what we're receiving from a child. Okay, let's start with our first branch. So we're thinking about the messages we communicate to ourselves. And I'd really love us to begin by being affirming to ourselves here. And I'd like you to start by affirming your own learning journey at this time. So I've put up some affirmations for you here. And what I'm doing is that I'm inviting you to choose one that resonates with you, or feel free to make up your own. And what I'd like you to do is take a moment to write down your affirmation on one small piece of paper and keep that for yourself. You can pause the video here if you need to do that. And as you're writing it down, imagine you are holding that tiny wild seed within your hands and you're speaking directly to it to nourish it. So here are some ideas. I am on my way to understanding how my autistic child uniquely thinks, learns, communicates, and interacts so that they can thrive at their own pace. I am on my way to knowing how to advocate for my child's needs in a way that honors their autonomy and dignity. I am on my way to creating supportive environments where my child feels understood, safe, and accepted for who they are. And once you've written it down, you can put your piece of paper off to the side to keep it safe for later. Or perhaps you just want to hold on to it a little longer as we continue talking together today. Okay, so now I'm thinking deeper about messages we give to ourselves. I'm going to reveal something very important. This is what I like to call the secret sauce to really move the needle for your autistic child's learning and communication development. And really, this is the main focus of support to make the most impact and what you need to master control of. And I feel like this is either going to blow your mind or you're going to be slightly mad that I say this, or really anywhere in between because, of course, all feelings and experiences are valid. So you ready for the big reveal? It's you. Is that what you guessed what I was going to say? Because the truth is, the shift begins with you, not your child. How we show up to support autistic kids is a direct reflection of how we view them. So, this first branch of communication also pertains to the messages we tell ourselves about an autistic child's actions. The information we were taught, we were shown, or we were introduced to, that all is going to impact our interpretation of an autistic child's actions. And then that will affect our own actions, our values, and life experiences. So, another way I like to think about this is our lensing impacts our interpretation of someone else's behaviors, which will in turn drive our response. Lensing impacts interpretation, which drives our response. And really, this is why it's so important to get more information to help us understand autistic experiences. So, their interests, their sensory experiences, how they learn, what's important to them, how they naturally communicate, all of those things. That's going to help shape our lensing, which will ultimately shape our responses towards them. So, I really want you to understand this concept. So, we're going to talk about it in a couple different ways. And the first way, we're going to do a little visual representation of this. Okay. So, I'm going to show you an image of something, and your job is just to guess what it is. But I'll give you a clue. It's rotting. Something rotting. Okay. I'm curious what your guess is about it. But more importantly, I wanted you to think about that initial feeling or response when you first saw it, when it first came on screen. Did you experience like a little grimace on your face, a little feeling of disgust? Did you kind of want to turn away from it? What was your body's response to that image? Okay, but now what happens if I give you a different piece of information to look at it through? What if I tell you that instead of viewing it as rotting, we know it's actually something that's cut or broken off of something, and that it's also part of a fruit. So, did your interpretation of this image change at all as you got new information? Did your response to this image change at all? For example, did you feel a little more curious or did you become a little more relaxed looking at it? So now let's take this new lensing and we're going to zoom out to get the whole picture so you can see what it is. Okay, so here is what it was. So did you guess it right? Or was it something different from you initially thought? And my guess is that from this new perspective, it now looks pretty good and delicious. I mean, like, unless you totally hate apples. Um, but your body might feel more relaxed because now it's something you can see that looks familiar to you. So, really, this is all to demonstrate that when we shift our lensing or the perspective at which we look something through, it will change our interpretation of it and then in turn drive our response. Okay, so now let's use this same concept of lensing and how that impacts our responses, but we're going to apply it to a situation with autistic kids. So, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to compare two possible lensing examples. So the first lens we can look through, I'm going to call it the fixer lens. And this is represented on my camera here by a what's called a fixed focal length lens. And so in photography, this is really a lens where you can't zoom in or out. It's just one focal plane. So taking a fixer lens would be when we are focused in on an observable behavior we are noticing, and we're looking at where we need to fix those behaviors if they feel problematic to us. Okay, so now imagine a situation with me. There's a preschool teacher who is outside with a group of children playing, and a minimally speaking autistic child in the class starts moving towards the classroom door to try to get inside. And this child is becoming increasingly frustrated that they can't go in. So, if we used the fixer lens, our interpretation of this situation might be something like, hey, this is problematic. They aren't listening to the rules. They're being stubborn. They can't just do what they want. They need to learn to stay with the rest of the group. Or they need to know they can't go inside right now because the group plan is to stay outside for playtime. And from that interpretation, the response may look something like using compliance-based strategies. And the main focus becomes on stopping the behavior. So that could look like telling the child no and trying to redirect them to something inside outside. It could be using a first then strategy to remind them that it's outside playtime first. Maybe it's physically blocking access to the inside door or taking them by the hand to move them away from the door. Okay, so now let's change our lens. So this is the same camera body, which is representative of the person, but we're just switching our lens. And we're going to switch to what I call the explorer lens. And this would be more like a zoom focus camera lens, where we can zoom in or zoom out to get a fuller picture of understanding what's going on. This lensing values curiosity to gain understanding, and it seeks to explore the perspective of the child first, and it looks at what other factors may be surrounding the observable behavior. Okay, so now we're looking at the same situation, we've just changed our lensing. So, young autistic child is trying to get inside the classroom door. Through this lensing, the explorer lens, the interpretation of this situation is led through curiosity to explore possible reasons, such as something might be stressing them out about being outside. There might be a sensory issue. They are trying to communicate a need. Maybe it's needing to use the bathroom or feeling cold or feeling hungry. Or maybe they need to get something from inside that's really important to them. Which means that our response may look something more like using alliance-based strategies. So, validating that you can see they feel it's important to go inside, going inside together to see what it is they are trying to communicate, and then supporting them to meet their need. Once you figure out the need, we can model language that would be helpful to them to get their need met in the future. So, really, this second lens aligns with neurodiversity affirming practices, which values connection or alliance over compliance. And we're looking at the foundations of helping a child feel safe, regulated, connected, and engaged. And I wanted to share this particular example as it was actually based on a real situation that a parent shared with me. And in this real life situation, the adults did take the first lens of the fixer lens, and they used a type of response related to that. The preschool teachers had reported that they spent a lot of energy trying to keep the child outside with the group, and the child spent the whole rest of the afternoon in a distressed state. The child's parent later put it all together once they got home and determined that their child had soaking wet socks. and they were trying to communicate he was trying to communicate his discomfort. And through his action of trying to get in the door, he was just trying to communicate that he needed to get dry socks that were inside his bag in the classroom. So, when we see a child demonstrating a challenging behavior, the question becomes, what message are we telling ourselves based on our lensing? Are we sending ourselves a message that this child is giving us a hard time or having a hard time? Are we telling ourselves that they are being willfully disobedient or manipulative, or that there is something deeper at play here and they could use my support, my compassion, and my leadership to move through it? Now, in continuing to think about ourselves and what's in our control, let's move into branch two of communication supports. So, these are messages we give to others directly about a child. And I want you to remember how we communicate to others about autistic kids, so that's our response, is really a direct reflection of how we perceive autistic kids and their actions. So that's our lensing and interpretation. In my very humble opinion, shifting how we communicate to others about autistic kids is one of the most crucial elements to focus on when you start your journey down aligning with neurodiversity affirming supports. Language is such a powerful tool, and the words we choose have the power to demonstrate acceptance, and equally, they have the power to cause harm and shame, even if that's done unintentionally. So, next, I'd like us to talk about some language changes that you can be using in your day-to-day life. And the first thing I would like us to get all on the same page about is this difference between the words neurodiversity and neurodivergent. These terms are not used interchangeably, though, although people are constantly mixing them up, like even professionals, I notice. So let's talk about the difference. Okay, so neurodiversity is an umbrella term or like an overarching term that acknowledges that diversity in our brains or our neurology that exists. So there are differences in the way all of our brains are structured or process information. And a simple way to put it is that we all have different brains and all of our brains work differently. So this is really going to affect the way we act, we think, we process information. You can think about our brains being diverse, just as we are diverse in other areas such as ethnicity, sexuality, gender, etc. And the key to remember about this term is it's used to reference a large group, not an individual. Okay, neurodivergent is more specific. So, this term, in a simple way to think about it, is having a brain that diverges or is different from the majority of society. So, you can think of it like diverging from the main path. And it refers to the way a person's brain is wired, which is usually from birth. And neurodivergence can include a lot of things. So, things like autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, dyslexia, dyspraxia, learning disabilities. All of these things are included under the umbrella of neurodivergence. And what's important about this term is it's used to reference an individual or a small group of similar individuals. Okay, and then the last one is neurotypical, which would just be the opposite of neurodivergent, and that's one whose brain functions, behaves, or processes with what we would consider like standard or typical. This one is also used to reference individual or a small group of individuals. Okay, so to help clear up any language confusion, let's use it in an example. Okay, so people tend to say, hear this all the time. They will say, a neurodiverse child. For example, how do I support my neurodiverse child to self-advocate? But I want you to remember that neurodiversity refers to a whole group of people, and that's a group that contains a variety of brains including neurotypical and neurodivergent, because it's that umbrella term. So in this case, because we are talking about a specific person or a child whose brain is different from the majority, you would actually use the word neurodivergent. Okay, sorry, lost my notes there. Neurodivergent. So in this case, we would say, how do I support my neurodivergent child to self-advocate? We wouldn't use the word neurodiverse. And I personally think that people tend to use neurodiverse more often because it seems, I don't know, like maybe a softer term, or maybe there's some underlying stigma around the term divergent. So that's just something to be thinking about. Okay, we're gonna play a quick little game to practice. Your job is to fill in the blank. So you're gonna pick a word, neurodiversity, neurodivergent, or neurotypical, and that would one of those words that's gonna best fit into these sentences. So if you want to play along, you can pause the video after I read each sentence to take your guess before I reveal the answer. Okay, so number one, I have a blank child that is autistic and loves playing with trains. So neurodivergent. Number two, Milo is autistic, but his older sister is neurotypical. When we say all brains are beautiful, we demonstrate that we value and celebrate neurodiversity. Okay, this one has two. Our classroom embraces blank by providing accessible accommodations to all, and we set up individualized supports for our blank students. So it'd be neurodiversity and then neurodivergent. Our classroom embraces neurodiversity by providing accessible accommodations. We set up individualized supports for our neurodivergent students. So I hope that helps clear up any confusion. Okay, so still thinking about our communication branch too. These are messages we give to others directly about a child. Let's continue talking about how reframing our language choices, how we can do that to be more affirming. So, how can we use affirming language when we speak to others about autistic children? The messages we give to others helps to model perspective shifts and the ways we want autistic kids to be viewed and treated. And really, this leads to a culture of acceptance around autistic differences. So, I want to mention a quick story here. Um, Thinking about this topic, it reminded me of what a preschool teacher shared with me recently of how they started shifting the way they were discussing to colleagues about a child in their classroom. And I thought it was so brilliant. The teacher mentioned to me that a colleague was talking about how an autistic child wasn't really following the class like journal prompt one day, and instead was drawing Elmo because he was obsessed with the character. And in response, this teacher just very calmly and supportively said back, "Oh, he was incorporating his special interest into his learning? That's great. What were you able to learn about Elmo from him?" And this subtle approach of modeling another way to rephrase and reframe the child's actions changed the whole energy of the conversation. It went from viewing him as being non-compliant to the classroom task and instead seeing him as being creative in the way he was interpreting the learning instructions, while also creating an opportunity to have a genuine conversation about something deeply personal and important to him and an opportunity to share his knowledge. So, in honor of using affirming language, I like to share with you 5 simple language shifts you can start making today. Okay, so instead of obsessive about, we could say passionate about, or highly interested in, or have an in-depth knowledge of, or they strongly relate to. Instead of fixates on, we could say they love learning about, or they're highly engaged in learning about. Instead of rigid or inflexible, we could say they prefer consistency, they prefer sameness, or they find safety in the familiar. Instead of stubborn or controlling, we could say they have a need for independence and autonomy. They're tenacious, routines are important to them, or they know what they want and they need. Instead of rude, we could say they stand up for their own beliefs, they self advocate for their wants and their needs, or they're factual and direct. So you can see how that really changes the energy when we're thinking about a child. Okay, let's go through one more example, but looking at it in terms of a sentence descriptor. So I have two options on the screen for you, and I'd like you to just think about which description feels better for you to hear. Okay, one, Clara can be quite stubborn and gets very upset when things don't go to plan or she doesn't have control over the situation. Or two, autonomy and independence are highly important to Clara. Clara prefers when she can make choices in the activity. Knowing the plan ahead of time, especially when there is a change, is important to help Clara stay regulated. Curious which one you chose. Okay, as we dive deeper into communication, we're now going to consider our branch three of communication supports, and these are messages we give directly to a child. We can start to think about how we are modeling language for a child and what kind of language we are choosing to create a communication rich learning environment. So, an important piece of information that I'd like you to all know is that most autistic people develop language through a unique processing style, and it's called Gestalt language processing. I'm curious if you've heard of this before. And really, this means that the way we support language development needs to be different. So, I'm going to tell you a quick story about this and then get more into the details about it. But quite a while ago, I had just begun working with a young child, and I noticed right away how he would repeat things I would say directly or speak using a lot of direct quotes from Peppa Pig. I also noticed that when he was asked questions by his mom, he would repeat the last part of the question back. So if she said, "Do you want pizza?" he would say, "Want pizza?" with the same intonation. And one day we were playing with a marble run set. You know, you build it and drop the marble down. And as we were building this, he started to get really upset. And then he started distressingly saying a quote from Peppa Pig. "If you jump in muddy puddles, you must wear your boots. If you jump in muddy puddles, you must wear your boots." And he was saying it over and over. And I was so super confused about how to respond. I was like, what did Peppa Pig and muddy puddles and boots have anything to do with this marble run? And his mom came downstairs when she heard him. And she just started looking around the room until she handed him a specific piece of the toy. And then he just happily carried on playing and building. And at the time, I just was like so confused. I didn't know anything about what was going on. And, but knowing what I know now about Gestalt language processing, I can absolutely more clearly see what happened and the link between his language and the activity. So he was using that script from Peppa Pig to indicate he was missing an important piece to do the activity, just like the boots you need to have in order to jump in muddy puddles. So we've been talking a lot today about looking at things through a different lens, and I want to offer another one. When we think about how children develop language, instead of thinking in terms of how they start off developing words, I'm going to ask us to reframe it to think about how that they are acquiring things in units of language. So we're not thinking about words, we're thinking how do they acquire units of language? Because did you know that there are two ways to develop language? And an important difference is how each style acquires those units of language. So a typical kind of standard way that most people would think of when it comes to language development is called analytic language processing. And for these kids, their beginning units do start off as single words. So they learn a bunch of single words at the beginning. And you may have or know a child that has developed language this way. But there is another way to develop language, which was shown in research by Dr. Ann Peters and Dr. Barry Perzant way back in the 80s. And this is called Gestalt language processing. And for these kids, their beginning units are actually chunks of words or groups of words that stay attached together. So for them, a whole phrase is one unit. Let's look at some examples to help you kind of visualize the difference between this. So in analytic language processing, this is where a kid's units of language start off as individual words as their building blocks, and they are usually quite referential. So like they're referring to things in their environment. And these kids can start combining them in new ways and building them up into longer and longer sentences. So they might start off with words like more, go, car, and then they combine them a little more together to two-word phrases. So go car, and then longer, more go car, until they eventually can build them up to something that looks like, look at my car going so fast. Let's do more. So let's compare that to Gestalt language processing now. So Dr. Barry Perzant, which was one of the researchers, determined that most autistic children were developing language in this way, and that they went through their own developmental stages that looked different from analytic processors. And then further longitudinal clinical research was done by someone named Marge Blanc over a 15-year period, which verified these stages of development. And she developed a model of their 6 stages, which she calls natural language acquisition. I'm not going to get too much into that, but an important piece of Marge's work describes how this is a natural and meaningful way for autistic kids to acquire and use language, and it's not a disordered way to learn language, which was our previous thinking. So this processing style is what we would associate with something like the terms echolalia or scripting, if you've heard those before. So in Gestalt language processing, this is where kids, their units of language start off as phrases or chunks or groups of words that stay attached together. And they're often related more to an experience or an emotion. So in the earlier stages, these units can't be broken apart, and the words associated will always stay linked together as a group. So for example, the phrase, here comes the car, would be viewed as one chunk of language. Here comes the car. Instead of being viewed as 4 separate words. Here comes the car. It's just one. Here comes the car. And in the earlier stages, it would only be said that one way. Here comes the car. Always with the same words together in the same order. But later, as they move through their natural developmental stages, they start to move parts of the chunks around. So they might say, here comes the snack, or let's get the car. And then they start to separate out more and more individual words from the chunks. So then they would move into a stage where they can break it down into more single words. So go, car, go, fast. And then the final stages are looking like this self-generated, original, flexible phrases. And that's language that's really truly their own and built from meaningful experiences. A small caveat here I just want to say is that we can take the lens of thinking about language processing more like a continuum. So we do need to leave room for the possibility that children can be developing language as what we'd call a dual processor. But that's a nuance that I won't really be able to get into right now, but I just wanted to point that out. So here's another way that I personally visualize the two processes. When I think about it in my head, this is kind of the image I came up with. I think of it like an analytic way is more of an inverted triangle. where they acquire a single word and then more single words, and then they combine them into longer and more complex ways. So the triangle gets bigger. Versus the Gestalt way, which means that they're starting off with these bigger chunks of language and then they're slowly breaking down these chunks to get to single words. And then from that point, that's when they begin this process of self-generated language and they're able to combine words in their own unique way into these longer and more complex ways. But you can really see how the start of it is so much different. And I want to make it clear that the goal isn't to make their language look like an analytic language processor, although it may end up looking very similar, but rather it's really to support each child in moving through their stages in their own time and their own way. People who are Gestalt language processors may continue to process and use language in Gestalts throughout their life. Even if they've developed that flexible, spontaneous language, this might really show up especially in like emotionally charged social or high stress situations. So you might hear adults even use this, and it's because their core processing style is still Gestalt, and it's their natural intuitive way of organizing thoughts and expressing themselves. Okay, here are some clues that your child may be a Gestalt language processor. So they might be very intonational in their spoken language. They could often be singing or just really highly engaged in listening to songs. And it can even be just one part of a song that they like to replay over and over again. Answering questions is difficult for them, and they may not respond with a direct answer. They might use long strings of language that can maybe sound like gibberish. They might repeat lines from movies, from shows, or from books, or repeat language from their environment. So, what they're hearing in conversation. And this is why the way we model language throughout a child's day is so important. Okay, so we see two patterns of language use with Gestalt language processors. They may use what's called immediate echolalia, which is when they repeat something directly after a person has said it. So if you said, "Do you want a snack?" They might say back, "Want a snack?" This is often used to help them process information. It can be to give themselves more processing time, maybe to take a turn in a conversation, or maybe they're committing to long-term storage of that piece of vocabulary or a phrase. They may also use delayed echolalia, which is repeating something they heard from like a movie, a show, a song, or that they picked up from someone talking in their environment, and they're going to use it at a later time. So the phrase like Chase is on the case from Paw Patrol, or if a child said, Henry, gotta go potty, to indicate that themselves that they need to use the bathroom because that's how people would be saying it to them. Henry, do you gotta go potty? So they would repeat it that way. Remember that this is a natural way to develop language, and some kids are going to move through the stages very quickly, but others are going to stay in the earlier stages of this process, and they may need support to move towards that self-generated language, which is our end goal. And this is when you'd want an SLP to help support you if they're in these earlier stages. I also want to highlight that scripts or gestalts are very meaningful and purposeful for the child using them. They are functional to them. And it's us that might not always understand the meaning behind it. So I think this was a misconception for a long time that when a kid's scripting or using echolalia, that it has no function or meaning, and that's not accurate information. So a simple song or a phrase can hold layers of meaning, and at earlier stages, the specific words cannot always be taken literally because they're often so tied to experience and emotion. These kids are using scripts to express how they feel, and it requires us to do the detective work to understand the underlying meaning. So here are a couple examples of gestalts from kids that I've supported and what we determined their meaning was. So one kid would say, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," in a very distressed way. And this was because it had a similar tune to the ABC song, and we figured out that they were using that to mean that something wasn't right. Something was wrong. Something's not following the order he thought it should. So he would use that in a distressed way. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Another one was thanks for watching from the end of YouTube videos. And for this child, the meaning was like, I'm finished with this activity or like it's time to go. And he even said that to me once when he wanted me to go. He's like, thanks for watching and pushed me towards the door, which was quite funny. Um, and then this other one was it was a bit of a song and he would say, sunscreen, sunscreen, where are you? Here I am, how do you do? Which was adapted from the family or the Finger Family song. And sorry for my singing there. And the meaning about this wasn't quite as clear, but our best guess for this one was that it was just a way of him expressing joy when he was playing outside as he related sunscreen to being outside. So he would use that when he was just really joyful for being outside. Okay, I think it's important that you also hear what Gestalt language processing can sound like. So I want to share a video example of a young child who is a Gestalt language processor, but this is him at an earlier stage. And in this video, you'll hear a very intonational and hopefully recognizable pattern of words. It is a very long script. It's based on a book, so that's your clue. And I'd like you to see if you can guess it. So you may notice that his speech sounds really unclear, but I'd like you to focus on the intonational pattern that you hear rather than trying to pick out individual words that he's saying. Okay, so I've covered it so that you don't get all the context, and we'll listen here.
Babu, babu, ba, I sing, I do, babu, babu, ba, I sing, I do, dance,
Okay, do you have a guess? What could it be? Okay, I'm going to reveal it, give you more information, see if you got it right.
I do,
I just always like to wait till his little laugh at the end there. It's so cute. But you can see in this video is Brown Bear, Brown Bear. And for him, that whole book was a gestalt. So it was very long. And if you didn't really have the context, it might have been hard to understand, but he would just say the whole book for him until at the beginning stages until he could break out around parts of it. I also want to point out that he was just very naturally incorporating his own special interest into this, where you can see and hear the train. So those were really important to him. So he liked having those around at all times, just as that was very regulating for him. So love that little video there. Curious if you guessed it right. Okay, let's talk about tips and strategies for supporting Gestalt language processors, as we now know that they do need a different kind of support. Um, so I'm going to share just 3 today that you can add to your toolbox, but there are so many more, but I'd like to just give you 3 to start with. So this really ties into branch 3 of our communication supports, which is messages we give directly to a child. So thinking about how we're modeling language to a child to support that communication-rich learning environment. So the first strategy we want to do, or the first tip, is we never want to ignore a child's scripts. So I think that was the messaging a long time ago, is if they're scripting, just ignore it and try to give them something more functional to say. But we know that it's functional to them, so we never want to ignore it. And instead, we want to acknowledge and validate all of their communication. And we can do this by repeating back what we heard them say. Or you can say, yeah, okay, or just like nod or smile if we don't understand. So remember, it's super meaningful to them, and that helps them in building that conversational turn taking of feeling validated their message was received and we're responding to it. So, the second is that we want to shift our focus from modeling individual words. We're shifting away from that, and instead we're thinking about how do we model more chunks or gestalts. So instead of modeling words like snack, more, go, we're going to shift to modeling short phrases like let's get snack, let's get some more, here we go, that's so fun, we need boots, I'm stuck. And bonus, if you can really lean into more of that emphasis and that fun intonational patterns, because those are going to likely kind of let that gestalt stick for the child. And third, we want to reduce the number of questions we are asking and instead model language as the child would say it. So you can think about it like you're being the narrator. So we would say, help me instead of, do you need help? Or let's get shoes instead of, Jordan, get your shoes on. And this is because at those earlier stages, remember that they're going to echo or repeat back exactly what they hear. So you want to think about being their little narrator and giving them information or modeling language throughout their day that they would want to use. Okay, on to branch four of communication supports. And this is interpreting messages we receive from the child. So the support strategies we are going to use for a child will depend on our interpretation of what we think a child is communicating to us. So do you remember back to the start of the story where I was talking about the child with the wet socks? This relates to that. So this is where it's really crucial to remember the importance of the lens we choose. I find that it can be really easy to get too focused on trying to grow a child's language use and getting them to use their words. And we put all of our effort there. But in that pursuit, we are missing some crucial foundations. Okay, so let's try on our Explorer lens. And remember, that's the one that equips us to zoom in and zoom out and get a fuller picture of what's going on for a child. And from this lens, we can zoom out to look at what else we need to consider in order for a child to access language and communication. I call this the foundations of communication, or sometimes I refer to it as the learning block tower. Okay, so in order to support higher level thinking and communication skills, which is often done when we're trying to teach some new skills or in school, that kind of thing, we may first need to make sure that they have a way to communicate their basic needs. But in order to access that, a child needs to have a level of engagement. And before that, they need a regulation of the sensory systems. But before that, first and foremost, they need a foundation of feelings of safety. So, safety, regulation, engagement, basic communication, and then higher level thinking and communication. But I want to point out that these are the foundations for every autistic child, no matter the level of support needs. Because while the specific strategies we choose may vary for a child, the foundations we need to think about are the same. And we can use these foundations as a way to more deeply interpret the messages we are receiving from a child because their actions are communicating something important to us. Okay, So let's use this in an example. Let's use an example during a transition. Let's say you tell your child that playtime is all done and it's time to get ready to go to preschool. But your autistic child seems to be ignoring your directions at first. And when you go to remove the toy out of their hand because you need to get to preschool, they suddenly throw it and they start screaming and they throw their body to the floor. So, one lensing we might take is that they're being defiant or they're giving us a hard time. Or we can use our explorer lens to interpret that they are communicating something to us about an unmet need at a deeper foundational level. So, in this moment, trying to use a strategy like saying to them, use your words, is really not going to be helpful. Because in this moment, they likely don't have access to their communication skills, which is at the top of the tower, and that thinking part of their brain, because their brain is in a stress state and using protection responses. So instead, we're going to look to those foundations for support strategies to help them get back access to communication. So let's start at the bottom. We're going to work our way up. I feel like the first question we should always be coming back to is, does this child feel safe? And the key word here is feel, not do we think they are safe? It's do they feel safe with me? Do they feel safe in this environment? The brain requires a felt sense of safety for all other learning to happen, or else it will stay in a stress mode and that fight, flight, freeze protection response. So from the explorer lens, we could be thinking about what about this situation could feel unsafe to the child in this moment. Perhaps they felt interrupted, being suddenly pulled out of a flow state of play, which felt unsafe to their brain. Or maybe it's a new routine and not knowing what to expect feels unsafe. Maybe it's the busyness of everyone in the house trying to get ready to leave at the same time. Or maybe it's anticipating a feeling of sensory overwhelm they experience as they enter into the preschool room. So feeling safe will mean different things to each child. And this is really where we'd want to have that strategy of co-regulation in our toolboxes. So that's demonstrating that you can be a safe, steady presence while they move through their distress. And they will only feel safe to trust the presence of those whom they've already developed a strong relationship with. Then we're going to move up to regulation and considering sensory regulation. And the action step to add to your toolbox would be to communicate to their body needs. So, providing options for sensory strategies or tools, like maybe giving them headphones to wear, giving them gentle squeezes if they're okay with that, maybe sitting with them and rocking them back and forth, or creating a quiet, low sensory space for them. Then, once regulated, we're going to move up to the engagement level. And this is where we're working on connecting back in with them. So, we can use support strategies like connecting through humor or little playful actions, maybe even through movement together, or spending some time engaging in a topic of interest to them. So, talking about it with them, showing them something about it, maybe drawing it out with them. So, their interests are going to kind of help bring their engagement back. And then from this space, we can move up to modeling language. So we aren't demanding that they are saying anything. We are just providing a model without requirement. And so this would include strategies for self-advocacy, such as indicating needing more time, or indicating it's too loud, or requesting a tool. And bonus is that we could think about modeling it as a short phrase to support our Gestalt language processors. And then we want to think about providing language models and opportunities to try on language that feels important to them, but ultimately they are in charge of their own voice. And then later, at a different time, we could consider using the strategy of collaborative problem solving with the child if that works with their skill level, which would be using their higher level thinking and communication parts of their brain. So we're not doing it in the moment of distress. We would do that later when they have access back to that. Okay. So we've talked about a lot today, and oh my gosh, there's just like so much more really I could share and talk about. But my hope is that you've had a chance to examine your own perspectives and received some insights into supporting communication through a neurodiversity affirming lens. So today we talked about the importance of shifting our perspectives and focusing on co-creating the right conditions to nourish our little wild seeds. We talked about choosing our lensing to help shape our responses towards supporting autistic kids, the power of language and those simple language shifts that we can start using to model acceptance out in our communities. We've talked about understanding more about natural autistic communication styles, and that's when we talked about the Gestalt language processing. And we talked about the need to examine the foundations of language when we are thinking about using supports and strategies. So, what I'd like to invite you to do now is just take a moment and write down one aha moment from today. So, one gold nugget or one insight, one idea that really stuck with you. It can even just be a single word to remind you of it. And once you write that down for yourself, you can pause the video here if you need to do that. Um, you're going to put that together with your affirmation that you wrote from earlier and just find a little safe space to store that somewhere in your house. And I invite you to open it up at a time later down the road. Maybe it's just even when you happen to stumble upon it. And you can consider it like a message for your future self when you need to hear it the most. And as you're doing that, I have a message that's on my heart that I'd really like to share. And then I'm going to go through a couple of resources with you to support you in continuing to move forward. So, my message for you: I see you, the parent who brings dedication and care to your child every day. And I understand that parenting is not always an easy task. And when you have an autistic child, it can sometimes feel like there are extra layers to navigate. But I want to remind you, every small gesture of understanding, patience, and kindness you offer makes a profound impact in their lives. Your autistic child experiences the world differently than others. Their needs may not always be visible or easy to understand, but they are no less real or important. Sometimes what seems like resistance or difficulty in communication is simply a reflection of their unique ways of processing the world. When you see the struggles, it's often because they are trying to make sense of things in their own way, and they need the connection and alliance to move through it. I encourage you to meet each child where they're at. Take the time to listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart. Seek to understand their unique communication, whether it's the words they are repeating from a favorite show, through their actions and body language, or even in the moments of quiet. I want you to remember you don't have to have all the answers. Trust your connection with your child and trust that you are exactly who they need. You are making a difference, one day, one moment at a time. So, where to go from here? Much like planting a seed, this is really just the beginning. Growing strong, resilient, and self-assured, neuro-confident kids takes a lot of nurturing. And some of you might be thinking, okay, well, what now? Where do I go from here? Don't worry, I've got some invitations for you to explore. So, we've been talking about working on changing our mindset, and this is reflective in the language we use. So think about ways you can change the way you are using language to create a more inclusive and accepting environment for autistic children so that they can feel welcomed in all spaces. For example, it might be in the way you describe them to other people or how it shows up in any documents you share with school staff. The next invitation is the next time an interesting or challenging behavior comes up, take time to choose your lens. Zoom out and ask yourself, what else could be happening? Get curious and use the child's perspective to think about what possible reasons this may be occurring. This is the most important skill I hope you take away from this discussion today. And the third invitation is commit to learning more. So, read a book about an autistic experience, listen to a podcast, choose one topic to really deep dive and learn more about. So, whether that's Gestalt language processing, sensory differences, or social differences, or find a neurodivergent person to follow on social media. And if my words resonated with you today and you'd like to stay connected with me, here are a couple ways you can do that. You can follow me on social media. I have a YouTube channel and Instagram, so you can follow me there. Or you can scan this QR code and I'll bring you to enter your email to get on my weekly email list. And this is just where I send out an email with resources, insights, stories, and possible future learning opportunities. So all you have to do is add your email to that. And then I do have some extra bonus resources that I've shared with you. You're going to find these on the Sturgeon School website under the link to this video. And so to support you with understanding more about neurodiversity affirming practices, I have a resource called 10 Guiding Principles for Neurodiversity Affirming Practices. And then for supporting shifting to more of that explorer lens, I have a resource called 15 Possible Reasons an Autistic Child May Not Follow Your Directions. And then I have a resource guide with some ideas of books, websites, social media accounts for you to follow. So that's all available for you to download. Okay, so we've made it to the end of our time together. And just another huge thank you for spending your valuable time with me today to learn more about neurodiversity affirming practices and care. Thank you for showing up with such an open mind and heart. And I truly hope you found some insightful little tidbits for yourself today. So, thank you.